Good afternoon, or evening, maybe morning. It's a delight to be able to facilitate international participation. My name is Ashley Hibbert, and I'm a research associate with the Center for the Study of Bible and Violence. And I'd like to welcome you very warmly to this, the first session of our CSBV Lent Book Club, looking at violence and peace in sacred texts, edited by Drs. Maria Power and Helen Paynter. And they're joined by respondent Dr. Georgina Jardim. My apologies. After I introduce them, just to give you a bit of a roadmap of our hour together, Helen, on behalf of herself and Maria, who it seems is not able to join us, will have 10 to 15 minutes to introduce the book. I'll then invite Georgina to respond for about 20 minutes, and we'll have the remainder of our time for discussion. Just as a matter of housekeeping, if I could ask everyone to be sure you're muted during the presentations, that would be appreciated. So let me introduce both of the editors of this book. It does seem that Maria may not be well and able to be with us, which is a terrible shame. She's become a wonderful friend. She is a senior research fellow in human dignity at the Las Casas Institute for Social Justice, Blackfriars Hall at Oxford. She's a graduate of the University of London and the author of 2 books on religion in Northern Ireland, From Ecumenism to Community Relations, and also Catholic Social Teaching and Theologies of Peace in Northern Ireland, which was published just last year. She's the editor of Building Peace in Northern Ireland, and of course, pertinent to today, Palgrave has just published this collection of essays on violence and peace in sacred texts that she's edited with Helen Paynter, to whom we come next. Helen is a Baptist minister with the Baptist Union of Great Britain, director of the Center for the Study of Bible and Violence, teaches biblical studies and biblical theology at Bristol Baptist College, is the author of a number of books, including God of Violence Yesterday, God of Love Today, which is an entry-level exploration of biblical violence that I make my students read. The Bible Doesn't Tell Me So, Why You Don't Have to Submit to Domestic Abuse and Coercive Control, which is aimed at women experiencing domestic abuse within church settings. And then, of course, among many other books which we could have talked about, again, is co-editor of our work today. And then our respondent, Georgina Jardim. Georgina is a senior fellow at the Center for Muslim Christian Studies at Oxford. Now, she's interested in thinking through and talking about contemporary issues that test faith, such as women's role and status in world religions. She's lectured at a variety of Christian institutions, including All Nations Christian College and Bristol Baptist College. She read Islamic studies in South Africa before moving to the UK with her family 20 years ago to take up a studentship at the University of Gloucestershire. Georgina's written on topics related to Christian-Muslim relations and reading the Bible and the Quran together. And most recently, she's published on the 19th century explorer David Livingstone's relationship with Muslims during his travels in the series Christian-Muslim Relations, a Bibliographical History, published last year with Brill. So some extremely accomplished scholars with us and involved in this project today, and I'm delighted to have them with us. So Helen, over to you.
Thank you very much. And let me say on behalf of Maria how disappointed she will be not to be with us. She messaged me earlier. She was struggling with a migraine and she was hoping to be well enough, but her absence tells us that she's probably still lying in a darkened room with something cold on her eyes, I imagine. But I need to give tribute to her because the book was her idea. The story behind the book is, from my perspective, is that she and I became friends on Twitter. This is back in about 20, maybe late 18, early 19, something like that. And I think we met in Oxford, in Blackwell's coffee shop, if I recall. And we were chatting, and she said, "Would you like to co-edit a book called Violence and Peace in Sacred Texts?" And I gave the matter about a minute's consideration. I said, "Oh yes, what a good idea." And today we finally, I finally have in my hand, I've only just got it actually, my copy of the book. Maria, I know, had been turning over the question in her mind for some time before that conversation. Let me tell you a little bit about what was in our minds really in approaching this. And perhaps a good way to start would be to mention a social experiment rather, which was posted on YouTube a few years ago. And some of you may have seen this. It was trying to explore people's attitude to the Bible and the Quran. And the person who was the investigator, if you like, walked up to random people in New York City, giving them a Bible wrapped in a Quran dust jacket, and then pointed them to some of the Old Testament texts which call for violence and for the subjugation of women, and then said, "What do you think about this then?" And most of the people who were stopped in the street didn't recognize that this was indeed the Bible. They thought it was the Quran they were looking at. And they were very quick to condemn the texts and to distance themselves from them. And some people actually explicitly compared these texts unfavorably with, quote, "what the Bible teaches," unquote. And there was almost universal shock when the experimenter removed the dust jacket and revealed the true identity of the text they had been sampling. Now, this experiment demonstrates a number of things, arguably none of them which the experimenter actually intended. It highlights the situation that in many parts of the world, popular opinion considers Islam to be a religion of violence. It exemplifies the fact that all the sacred texts of the world faiths contain some violence. And it shows the danger of evaluating anybody's faith based on an uninterpreted and selective reading of proof texts. And just as an aside, as the mother of 3 daughters who are now all grown up, but who all went through our religious education system in the UK, when they were doing what we call GCSEs, which is the age 16 exam, the national exams, I was helping them to revise for their RE GCSEs, and I was appalled by the way they did Christianity as their main religion and Islam as their secondary religion. And I was appalled by the way that Christianity was being represented, by the way that it was basically teaching these young people that Christians just proof text and don't really think their faith through. And if that was true of the faith of which I am most familiar, I have every reason to think that it would have been true for the other faiths as well, which were under investigation. So, and that's a UK comment, of course. I can't comment beyond that, but it does say something about I think the parlous state of our awareness of other people's faiths and faith texts. Now, globally, one of the use of sacred texts to promote violence is one of the pressing issues of our time. In recent years, many societies and cultures have entered a new era of polarization in which appeals to sacred texts are made in the pursuit of political and economic gain. And further, current global events such as the rise of groups like ISIS, Christian fundamentalism in the US and Eastern Europe, place religion, and in particular attitudes to violence and peace, at the centre of global political discourse. In such instances, sacred texts may be deployed in a reductionist manner, with tropes taken out of context to enhance their popular appeal. But alongside this, the perception of other people's faiths as violent and other faith texts as deplorable furthers suspicion, polarisation, and violence within and across communities and nations. But in actual fact, the interpretation of sacred texts by adherents of each faith is far more subtle than the popular imagination allows. Each of the major faiths has its own interpretive practices which seek to grapple with the complexities of what are generally very ancient texts. These interpretive practices may be developed in the academy or in the community. They're generally part of long traditions of interpretation within faith communities. But just as each sacred text contains violent myths, narratives, laws, prayers, and so on, so they all in various ways call for peace. We were interested, among other things, in how these apparently contradictory perspectives were reconciled by interpretive communities. Is one text abrogated by the other? Does one text have interpretive control over another? Are divergent texts held in tension with one another? Is appeal made to diachronic, that is, through time, development within these texts? So the conception for this volume arose from our own grappling with these problems. Maria is a Catholic social ethicist and peace advocate, and I am, as Ashley has said, a biblical scholar with an interest in violent biblical texts. Positioned as we are within the Christian faith, although within very different traditions, we are far more aware of the Church's perspective on violence and peace than we are of the approaches taken in the other faith traditions. And we were keen to learn how those of other faiths grappled with these matters within their own sacred communities. We wanted to learn of the issues and the interpretations within other faith traditions, but we also wanted to learn from other faith traditions about the hermeneutical approaches that they were taking in these regards. And so we therefore set out to commission a range of essays which would attempt to identify some of the issues raised by the texts of the major world faith traditions, and then to try and plot something of the diversity of responses that were offered. And we make no claim that we have in any way offered an exhaustive study of the range of approaches taken by any of the faiths, including our own. But we try to sample, and most of the faiths have 2 chapters in order to try and represent a little more of the range of approaches taken. Too often hermeneutical work like what we are showcasing here takes place within academic or confessional communities which are siloed from one another. Our concern for orthodoxy, correctness of belief, or orthopraxy, correctness of practice, and perhaps for apologetics, our defense of our faith, tends to drive our conversation inwards. And here, by bringing together in a single volume voices from a diverse range of faith traditions who are willing to air some of the internal struggles on these issues, we seek to break the conversation out from these silos and to open up spaces for generative and generous dialogue. This is further facilitated by a concluding chapter, which draws together some common threads and offers some way forwards. I could take you on a tour of the chapters in the book, but I think that would probably take up too much of our time. So I think I might stop there. I'm very happy to return to that if that comes up in the questions. What I will say is that Maria and I found it really challenging to read and edit chapters which were from traditions well beyond our ken. Within the Abrahamic traditions, we felt we had at least some common understanding. But when we were looking at texts from Buddhists, Hindus, and Sikhs, this was a real stretch. And so I'm certainly not going to try and answer any technical questions on those chapters. We're having a range of conversations on the book. Today, I'm guessing will be relatively focused on the Christian faith and perhaps on the interfaith questions. We've already had an event that looks from a Jewish perspective, and we'll have some more in due course. But I think at that point, I will be quiet and hand back to Ashley or directly to Georgina.
Yeah, thank you, Helen, for that really helpful orientation and a very interesting narrative that introduces us to the book. Georgina.
Thank you, Ashley. Thank you, Helen. I'm going to share a PowerPoint simply because we're not in one room and we can't sit comfortably in some chairs facing each other. So this is just for a change of scenery, really, so that you have something else to look at while I speak. And also, I'm not one of these techie types, so I'm still reading from pieces of paper rather than from my screen. So yeah, it's to avoid the difficulties that might pose. So I just firstly want to congratulate Helen and Maria for not only addressing the topics of violence and peace in sacred texts, in their own texts and traditions, but doing that alongside others. And also just to be, may I use the word perhaps prophetic, in that the book seems to be more pertinent now in our current world. You know, as I was reading some parts of it, I just felt it couldn't have been more timely almost. It really gave me insight that I needed at this time. And so I think all the authors have been courageous in dealing with a sensitive topic in an open forum, where those who are not initiated or familiar with one's own teachings and beliefs are present. So it's not my role to give a summation of the volume here, as that is expertly done in the final chapter. Here I want to respond by thinking through some questions raised for me by the volume, and then having a conversation about a perceived lacuna in the text with a selected reading from the Bible that I've been thinking about for a while. So I want to explore the ways in which we take a stance of curiosity or defensiveness in relation to particularly violence in the text. So I'm going to talk about violence rather than peace, but the extent to which we are curious about our own text, or perhaps feel defensive about our texts in relation to this topic. And I'm going to do this by looking at three aspects raised in the volume. So if you haven't read the book yet, these will be new to you. And if you're going to read it, then you will certainly come across them. And the first of these is interpretive strategies, and then selective readings. And then the third one is managing the interfaith, or we might even say the pluralistic space of our public square, the square where we have people who do not share our beliefs and who come from a multiple perspectives. So when it comes to interpretive strategies, one of the articles by Mittelman points out that there are 5 positions to the text. The denial, to find the victims irredeemable. So he takes the example, for instance, of Sodom and Gomorrah, and points to the idolatry that was irredeemable. Or legalization, where we provide procedures for dealing with violence. Or moralization, exploring the parameters of our understanding in terms of the nature of God and our response. Politicization, where we bring questions of our identity. Or historicization, where we understand the text as a cultural product. Now, these understand the violence in the text in terms of systems, where they add layers of complexity and procedures. And by putting them into such perspective, our interpretive strategies place a distance between us and the violence in the text. And it can help us to see it more objectively, which is certainly a good stance, so that we can obtain some balance and stability as we consider things that affect us, perhaps on an emotional level. However, there are also warnings towards dismissive attitudes towards the text, that as well as distance, we can also dismiss the text as belonging to a different era or different time, or different people. Then when it comes to selective readings, these may certainly form part of our interpretive strategies, where we select texts and passages and verses that may affirm and on rare occasions challenge our interpretation. In a positive sense, we can maintain our curiosity by selecting passages that challenge us, or are at least not well trodden in our own traditions or our devotions. On the other hand, we can trot out selective one-liners or passages that close down further exploration and thinking. Personally, I've been on the receiving end of such phrases as, but it was Eve who ate the apple first, or women must learn in silence, or in my Quranic studies, the idea that men are the maintainers of women because God has given them a degree of excellence above women. Our selection of the text can therefore display, if not to others, at least to ourselves, whether we are being defensive or keeping a curious stance towards the text. Helen's discussion of the distinction of the Old Testament God versus the New Testament God that developed in some interpretive traditions feels like one of those defensive stances that wanted to put the difficult texts into a neatly wrapped up box. The third one, managing the interfaith space, the article by Alicia Pomazon describes interfaith dialogue and practices of scriptural reasoning, which is the field within which I operate. And she speaks of the multi-directionality of the sacred text, that it can go anywhere, especially in an interfaith conversation. And it makes the reading interesting or even inspiring, but also dangerous. And she says, it can be the difference between life and death in some circumstances. She describes an incident early on where interfaith conversation had led to a confrontation, and her experience of that shaped her engagement ever since, so that it became a peace-building exercise in the main. And I certainly find this laudable, the idea of interfaith encounter as peace-building. However, I have sometimes wondered, and this has been raised by others, whether the interfaith space turns into a choreographed or a managed space where true opinions and beliefs can become obscured, or the selection of texts are skewed for the sake of peaceful meeting rather than for truth seeking in the text. This is not only for the particularities of interfaith dialogue, but for our face-to-face encounter in the public square. Once we know each other well and we've built friendships, are we still able to name the blasphemy from a Muslim perspective, or the affirmation of faith from a Christian perspective, that Jesus is the Son of God, for instance? So coming to the lacuna in the volume, at least as far as Alicia's comment right at the end, that there is no definition of violence in the volume. On page 254, she says, interestingly, the individual chapters in this volume seem to shy away from defining violence itself. There are descriptions of violent episodes and types of violence with related concepts such as exertion or jihad, but no particular definition. So here I want to think about the biblical metaphor of bloodshed, or the pouring out of blood as definition of violence, and to do this by way of a story within the narratives about King David. So I'm not going to look at this comparatively, and we can certainly pick that up in the question and answer time. But I'm going to look at this from my Christian perspective and as part of our thinking around Lent. The shedding of blood per se is not necessarily at issue, as certain rites require the shedding of blood as part of the sacrificial system. For example, circumcision or animal sacrifice, or the carnivorous diet that is inaugurated in Genesis. Granted, these are given after the disobedience of God's command. But at stake here is the significance of blood as a sign of life and the blood of innocence. It is explicitly mentioned as one of 6 things the Lord hates, or the 7 he finds this detestable in Proverbs 6:17. We see the shedding of innocent blood as detestable, as something that attracts blood guilt. And here we may think of the Cain and Abel narrative discussed by Mittelman in the volume. Yet it is not only the slaying of the obviously innocent that attracts guilt. What about excessive force during military campaigns, or the violence of corruption and systemic injustice, as addressed by Maria Power? So in 1 Samuel 25, and I don't know if you had time to have a look, it might not be easy to follow this as I speak. You might have to follow this up afterwards. We read the narrative of David and the wealthy farmer Nabal and his intelligent wife Abigail. In the Bible, the encounter is told as an episode in narratives about David's ascent to the throne. The scene is set in the time after David's anointing, but before he's publicly recognized during his flight from Saul. He collects around him a band of 600 men, and he trades on a reputation of military might. David sends a delegation to Nabal to extract provisions from him during the time of the sheep shearing festival. It's not described as a festival, but it's generally understood as a time of festival. Nabal is described as a very wealthy property owner with a wife, Abigail. The husband, whose name in Hebrew means fool, and who was surly and mean in his dealings, is identified as a Calebite, in contrast to his wife, an intelligent and beautiful woman. David's envoys deliver his message, but Nabal declines their request and dismissively retorts, "Who is this David? Who is this son of Jesse?" equating David and his band of men with runaway servants. The envoys return with this reply, and upon hearing Nabal's response, David counters with an immediate order to war. He commandeers his men to put on their swords and to advance on Nabal's homestead. A servant in Nabal's household, ever alert to the consequences of their master's decisions, tells Abigail this. She acts on the servant's report, losing no time in gathering an abundance of provisions. The servant seems to take a calculated risk in sharing his opinion of Nabal with his master's wife. He says, "Nabal is such a wicked man that no one can talk to him." By approaching Abigail with his fears, the servant had weighed up his knowledge and experience of Nabal's foolhardiness and Abigail's wisdom. As mistress of the household, Abigail could have exposed him to Nabal and ingratiated herself with her husband. Instead, the servant's knowledge and experience of his master's characters is proven right, and the servant, in effect, initiates the salvation of his household. Both the servant and Abigail the wife are of lower standing in terms of classical patriarchal hierarchy. Yet in terms of the text, both are presented as key figures in driving the plot forward and stating wider significance in the narrative. So Abigail tells her servants to go on ahead, I will follow you, but she did not tell her husband Nabal. In the same way that she is hemmed in by a ravine on her approach to David, Abigail is caught between the rivalries and egos of two men. She takes a course of action to appease the one, David, for the sake of the other, her husband. The one advances with military might, while the other revels in his wealth displayed at the festivities of harvest time. She cannot be sure of the outcome, and the text heightens the sense of menace by revealing that David had just expressed a threat to exterminate all the males in the household of Nabal. David's assessment of Nabal and his men seems to match the dismissive attitude Nabal had displayed to David's emissaries earlier. While the text characterizes Nabal as a fool and David as the Lord's anointed, both men seem evenly matched in their impulsiveness and their derision of each other. Abigail sees David in the immediate aftermath of his brash expression, heightening the incongruity of an attractive, intelligent woman finding herself facing up to blustering and rampaging men intent on destruction. Even if Abigail does not show fear, the reader is anxious on her behalf as she takes a deferential approach to David, dismounting from her donkey and bowing face down to the ground at his feet. Opening with dutiful speech, she offers herself as blameworthy for the situation, yet distancing herself from her husband's actions. May my lord pay no attention to that wicked man, Nabal. He is just like his name. His name is Fool, and folly goes with him. But as for me, your servant, I did not see the men my master sent, she says in verse 25. Abigail's gifts and her posture mark a clear hierarchical positioning between the female and the male in this scene. Abigail is a lone woman among the band of armored men, prostrate on the ground at the feet of David, while he towers over her. Yet her address over the ensuing 6 verses belies the character positioning of the scene. Abigail is articulate and authoritative, even while infusing her speech with master-slave terminology. She points out that David has been kept from bloodshed by the Lord and presents her gifts to be distributed to his men. Her reasoning shows a depth of knowledge as she deftly recounts a key episode of David's fame through wordplay. In verse 29, she recalls David's slaying of Goliath with a slingshot. She places David as such a living pebble in the pouch of the Lord. The enemies of David will likewise be as pebbles that the Lord will hurl away as from the pocket of a sling. In contrast to her husband's dismissal of this son of Jesse, Abigail assuredly states that the Lord shall make good his promises to David. She announces that he will be leader over Israel, yet she warns against unnecessary bloodshed for the burden it will place on his conscience. David recognizes her as a wise emissary, directing his praise towards God for sending him Abigail. He proclaims a blessing over her for her good judgment and for keeping him from vengeful bloodshed. This is in verse 32 to 33. David accepts her gifts and grants her request, reviewing the path of vengeance he had embarked on earlier and from which she has now dissuaded him. It becomes apparent that Abigail would have been a target of violence together with the men of Nabal's household, as David confesses that her initiative had kept him from harming her. Abigail's actions and speech thus avert disaster over herself and her household and provoke transformation in David's thoughts and actions. Although she is described as beautiful and intelligent, when we encounter her for the first time, her act displays an extraordinary perception of the wider significance of David. Her pragmatism puts her household wealth to David's disposal, but it's Abigail's humility and her theological acuity that draws out the ultimate meaning of the encounter for the wider Davidic narrative. Falling at the feet of the one whom she fears, the wielder of military power, the monster of threat is assuaged. Her words display prophetic wisdom in identifying David's battles with those of the Lord and foresee his preservation from Saul's persecution to become leader over Israel and to set up a lasting dynasty. Yet, she also warns against the staggering burden of needless bloodshed and motives of revenge that would be revisited on David. On Abigail's return home, her words recounting the events to Nabal are enough to strike him with a fear that makes his heart fail and turn to stone, leading to his death 10 days later. Things did not end well for Nabal, the enemy of David, as Abigail had intimated in her speech prior to the calamity that befell him. She had no need of military might, and her mere speech was enough to strike mortal fear into him. Upon hearing of Nabal's death, David honors Abigail's wish to be remembered. He calls for her hand in marriage, recognizing God's hand in the return of events. At this summons to be part of the king's household, she once again responds with radical humility. She repeats her deferential posture, bowing down to the ground and pronouncing herself ready to serve you and wash the feet of my master's servants in verse 41. So while Abigail would all but disappear from the text after Nabal's death and subsequent marriage to David, her words would come to mark David's legacy in a particular way for the chronicler. Towards the end of David's life, he recognizes himself as one unable to build a temple to the Lord, because in the end, he had shed much blood and fought many wars, as in 1 Chronicles 22, verse 8 to 9, and again in 1 Chronicles 28, verse 3. Furthermore, in her humble posture that is prepared to wash the feet of others, Abigail shares the hospitable demeanor of others in Israel, including Abraham in Genesis and Jesus of Nazareth in the Gospels. In these ways, Abigail joined the chorus of those prophesying David's kingship and God's covenant loyalty in spite of her apprehension at facing up to the threat. The results of her actions deliver herself and her household and provide a warning to the anointed of God not to be tempted by violent aggression, but to maintain a clear conscience before God. So that was all a bit long and wordy, but what I would like to do is to pose this narrative for us to explore ideas of violence, whether of military or of systems, and its counter narratives in the Bible as we stand at the beginning of this Lent series.
Thank you very much for that thoughtful meditation on violence and its prevention in this particular text. So I'd like to open us up to questions and discussion on this book, and would invite you to present questions to either Helen or Georgina or both. I think we're a small enough group that I would just invite you to unmute yourselves and ask your questions. I don't think there's any need for undue formality in this group. If you would prefer to put your question into the chat, one of us will notice it and ask it for you. And so maybe I'll just kick us off if I can actually back up to something Helen observed about the process of the book, sort of on a big picture. Because you had said it was difficult to critically assess and edit contributions from particularly outside the Abrahamic traditions. And so, Georgina, does any of that come through in the book? And Helen, how did you and Maria attempt to manage and mitigate that level of unfamiliarity?
Does any of that come through in the book? I think the authors were also aware of the precious aims of this book in terms of bringing people together who are not familiar with each other's traditions and texts. And I think they very skillfully framed the conversations in such a way that we could relate. So for instance, I'm just thinking about the conversations around Hinduism that took the historical period of colonial India as a framework, so that one could actually relate to it historically, if you couldn't relate to all the technical terminology within the Hindu tradition, for instance. There may very well be, I was just thinking about some of the pieces on Islam, where I was familiar with authors and terminology, but I'm not so sure that it would always be clear to someone who doesn't know. But it is never so obscure that you can't make meaning of it. No.
Thank you. And I think to respond to the question from my perspective, I would say that I mean, we sent chapters back, and some of the chapters that we were sent never made it. we had to recruit new people because one or two of the the original people we'd asked didn't come through with what we'd asked them to do, which is always a frustrating thing in the process of editing. But I suppose what I would say is that Maria and I would regard ourselves in some sense as the ideal reader, which is as some of you will know, is a kind of technical sense, but particularly for the non-Abrahamic religions, the ones about which we were starting from almost ground zero, but hopefully, you know, kind of intelligent, interested amateurs, if that makes sense. And so if we couldn't understand it, then we assumed that our readers wouldn't be able to, or our other ideal readers, the people we're hoping will pick it up, wouldn't be able to understand it. So from that point of view, we didn't feel too ashamed to send things back going, no, doesn't make sense to me. So, you know, you need to work this through a little bit more. Yes, to what extent we were successful with that, I don't know, but I think in a sense, bringing our ignorance to the process maybe helped. We also did ask them to peer review each other's when they were in pairs.
Oh, great. Well, thank you. That's a helpful bit of insight. Oh, what other questions or perhaps relatively brief comments do we have for our editor and respondent?
I'm interested. I haven't read the book, I confess, yet, but I'm interested. We've spoken solely about violence so far. Did you get a vision of, I mean, in the sense of the vision of peace shared between the different religions? Were there significant differences in emphasis that you noticed?
Do you want to respond to that, Georgina?
I mean, I certainly, I was so struck by Maria Power's conversation around the Roman Catholic tradition that just felt so current that I can almost, you know, it almost clouds my thinking about any of the others. Just in terms of the evolving conversation around not just war theory, you know, but the thinking around the Augustinian ideas of just war, but the more recent thinking around excessive force and what that might do, and the stance against nuclear armament as a negative, you know, that we are essentially, although we might be in a time, might have been, perhaps I should say, in a time of peace in the post-war period, after the Second World War, it was described as a negative peace because it was an armed peace. And in a sense, that has stuck with me. You know, what is the peace? So that definitely came through, but in a sense of a question, in terms of what is the peace, either of the status quo or the peace that we are striving towards, personally and within our communities and our collective movement as a society.
And in terms of kind of themes that went across, we did see something of that sense of peace of the state, the peace in quotations of the status quo, and the extent to which that was true peace. There was that came through in some of the chapters. I think, and it's interesting that this was commented on when we had a previous online event. I think I said we had one that was, perhaps it was before the event started, sorry, but we had a similar event with one of our Jewish contributors and a Jewish respondent. And she commented on the fact that she felt that violence had received more attention than peace in the volume, and I think that's true, and I think that's fair, and I think that's quite interesting. I think perhaps it reflects the degree of discomfort that we all share around the violence, and so we felt we needed to give more space. And I think often people's discussion of peace was framed around the mitigation of the violence rather than a positive vision. We do get some. I try and give a little bit of a positive vision in my own chapter, and I think we do get in one or two others. But I think to a certain extent it was mitigation rather than something positive.
Yeah, even if it was looking at, I think in a sense it was trying to say that there have been different strategies, different commentators, different interpretations of violent text to, in a sense, show the tensions and the ambivalences that there are within various traditions. So that is almost the unsaid piece, the reason why we can't make peace with these texts. We keep returning to them and rethinking them and rereading them in a quest for peace.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any sense, still trying to figure out how to phrase this question, any sense that the definitions or severity of violence or kind of how violence is perceived changes from faith to faith because of differing visions of peace? Could it be that the kind of what constitutes violence, or at least what constitutes kind of severe violence, changes from text to text because the vision of what actually constitutes peace is different?
I don't know what you might think about this, Helen. I'm thinking about is it Mittelman once again, who talks about the rabbinical interpretation of the text on the holiness of the Sabbath, and this incident of the man who collects firewood on the Sabbath with the command to then be stoned, and how the rabbinical tradition deals with this incident in trying to deal with, to understand it, both the principles and perhaps the procedures, I think Mittelman's words is almost to justify it out of existence, I think is what he said.
Yeah, and I think you're right, Ashley. I think that is going on to some extent. I think in order to answer the question fairly to the faith traditions which aren't represented in the room, I would need to go back and reread those chapters with that particular question in mind. So I'm cautious about speaking carelessly about the other chapters that I didn't author, but I do think that we see a sense of that. I think the sense of what the vision is, the vision, what the vision for peace is in terms of what we might call in terms of societal structures, I think varies. It varies within the sacred texts, and it varies between them, and no doubt within them as well. And I think that always frames our understanding then of what peace truly is. And I wonder if that even takes us back to what Georgina was saying about Nabal and Abigail, about in the sense of what's the peace that she is advocating, or what's the absence of violence that she's advocating, and in what kind of societal construct is that being framed?
Yeah, I was just thinking about one concept in particular that might relate to what you're saying around in the Islamic tradition, the idea of jihad, and how that has been differently understood and interpreted across different eras. You know, that as it's put in that article, the lesser and the greater jihad, the lesser jihad being the military one, and the greater jihad being the exertion against the self.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and how that, you know, almost in some eras has been, and by some interpreters have been upended. So one might argue that ISIS has turned the two upside down.
Mm. And one of the other things that that I would say I noticed is the wrestling with what violence is acceptable is definitely framed, is shaped by the position of those who are wrestling. So one of the chapters on Hinduism looks at the sort of colonial project, and the question of how that shapes the wrestling with the texts, and so I think that those things are interesting as well, whether these are texts which are being employed by the subaltern or by the ruling classes.
Yeah, and that was very interesting for the ruling classes not having a full understanding of the text, and then oversimplifying, and in their oversimplification causing, well, not direct, but in amongst many other causes, but adding to the rift in India in particular between Hindus and Muslims as a result of this oversimplification of religious identity. To try and manage the pluralistic space.
Mm-hmm.
This is really interesting, but I'm conscious of our time, and that there might be others who had burning questions to raise. So if I can cut you off there and invite those questions in our last few minutes. Oh, perhaps I shouldn't have cut you off there. Are there any final remarks that perhaps Helen, that you'd like to make in response to the response?
No, just to say thank you for bringing that. I think that as you were speaking about Abigail's intervention, I was thinking about one from which I looked at in my doctoral study from the Book of Kings, where there is divine intervention to avert a war, and it's a bizarre little story of God striking people blind, and the prophet, who was the person that the soldiers had come for, leading them into the parlor of their enemy, the king, and then telling the king just to give them a feast and send them on their way. And it's a very odd story, but it's a really interesting a version of violence. And I just sort of was comparing those in my mind as you were speaking. I think these texts, speaking for the text that I study, but I think that it would be fair to say that we saw this theme more widely. The texts contain, the texts express unease. They don't speak with a single voice on the matter of violence and peace. I did work around polyphonic voices, so voices that are in dialogue with one another, and learning the subtlety of learning to listen to those voices in dialogue and not seek to necessarily try and resolve the dialogue. I don't think, if I remember correctly, any of our contributors used the language of polyphony, but I think we see some of that going on. So there is a sense in which interpreters through the ages have wrestled with these questions, but also noticing, I think, that the texts themselves begin that conversation.
Yeah, thank you. That's
May I?
very interesting. Oh, sorry. Yes.
Sorry, may I just point out one thing that seems to come out from both the story that Helen just spoke about in Kings and the David narrative, is the importance of food. I know hospitality is a much, it's everywhere these days, isn't it? But the importance of food as something that brings people together and is a vehicle of peace.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. That sounds like a study that needs to happen next. Peace and covenant and food and fellowship. Of which, if only this could have been in person, we might have had the bad coffee and donuts that that churches and academic institutions use to create such fellowship. May I close us in prayer as we end this time together? Lord, as we think about what it is to be a people of peace in our pluralistic contexts, would you give us grace and openness to hear from others, to respect and engage with and benefit from the traditions all around us, even as we hold strongly to our own convictions of Jesus as the one who speaks perfect grace and perfect truth into the lives of his people. Would you make us first and foremost a people of his peace and his humility, especially as we contemplate humility and suffering in this Lenten season. Would you bless the efforts of peace, especially as represented by our scholars here today, Georgina and her interfaith work, and Helen and her work with the Center for the Study of Bible and Violence. Would peace come from these good works? It is for Jesus and through Jesus that we bring this prayer to you. Amen.